provide tools to nurse leaders so that they can find their work more meaningful and joyful. So thank you for joining us. I want to tell our audience a little bit about you. Ovell Barbee is a human resource strategist. Ovell and I worked together several years ago with Spectrum Health. He's the owner and principal of Ovell Rome Associates, and he's a renowned visionary human resource leader, consultant, and speaker with a passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's held executive positions at Fortune 500 companies in industries like Motorola, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the healthcare industry with Spectrum Health, Indiana University Health. And I know from experience that you drove sustained cultural change and reduced barriers for diverse populations in each one of those positions, and that you had a very human-centered approach to what you did. I know that, Ovell, I know that you've been lauded. You're a great speaker. I know you've spoke in a lot of circuits and have won many awards for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I can't wait to get started with our conversation today. So welcome.
Thank you, Norma. I'm honored that you would feel comfortable in extending an invitation. You are a key member of my village, so I am honored to join you today. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation as we always do.
Sounds good, and we'll try to have some fun too. So, Ovell, I want to start with this, the big house. You most recently wrote again, an award-winning book, a bestseller in Amazon, The Big House. What inspired you to write this book? What is the message that you were trying to get across for all of us?
Well, I think for me, as I thought about maybe there is a story, I think that every person has a story. And as I was contemplating what I wanted to do with my next chapter, so many people would ask me over the years, well, you kind of stayed true to your core. How did you do it in terms of you being from, modest beginnings by society standards, obtaining 2 master's degrees as a African American male, successfully making it to the C-suite? I would get repeated questions about how did you do it? And so I thought that it would be best for me to write about my journey as a diverse leader, and then also take a step back from that and say, if I were, pushing HR and DE&I to do better in corporate America, what recommendations would I make? And now you had the Big House, which is my story about my experiences in corporate America, and not all positive, and culminating with, again, the recommendations to do better.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it, and I thought the recommendations that you had in the book are really, really useful for any organization that's trying to go through that journey, and not just say that they're going through it, but actually doing it and being successful at it. And one of the things that I read in your book, and I'm going to read it verbatim because I don't want to, is that we need to create environments that allow people to bring their whole selves to work. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very reflective for me as I start, having conversations about the book. And you think about the saying, people should be able to bring their whole selves to work, and that should be okay. And contributing to a person are their cultural differences, work styles, personalities, all of that shaping who you are as an individual. And it wasn't until a middle point in my career that a leader pushed me to bring more of my authentic self to work. And I think I was very cautious about how I could be viewed, and factoring in a biased lens in terms of how I felt I could, be subjected to punitives that some of my colleagues might not, if I brought more of myself to work. And this boss, she basically said to me, what is the worst thing that can happen to you at work? And I said, actually, I could be fired. And she said, "What would you do?" I said, "I would pick myself off the ground, dust off my resume, and I would find another job." And she said, "For you to be the most effective leader you can be, you have to be okay with the worst possible outcome." And I felt in that moment, she actually gave me permission to start demonstrating more of my authentic self. And a lot of people, when I tell them about my early childhood experiences of being in a neighborhood where you might have to defend yourself, etc., those were elements that I didn't always bring forward in my ascent in terms of growing as a leader in corporate America. And but once she gave me permission and said, I'm going to support you because part of the expectation of being a leader is that you will challenge the status quo. And as you mentioned earlier, especially in the DE&I space, it's very challenging that for organizations to experience change, you can't always accept the standard or the status quo in terms of how an organization may be operating.
Mhm. So along those same lines, Ovell, you talk about the masks that people bring to work or the concept of fitting in. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that any organization has, norms that will be established in terms of, like work hours, acceptable behaviors, etc. But a lot of times, if we take a step back from it, those can be established without having diverse perspectives factored in. And so it's from whose lens are we saying these are acceptable behaviors, etc. So you will hear from diverse team members that they feel like a lot feel like they have to adapt to a majority standard in terms of interactions, especially in the workplace, and that they could be subjected to a punitive if they bring more of their authentic selves to the workplace. It's a very interesting phenomenon.
It is. I was sitting at the beach in Puerto Rico one time with my husband a few years ago after living in the Midwest for most of my adult life. I went to college in Milwaukee and so I was in Wisconsin and Michigan for most of my career. And I was sitting there and I felt at that moment that I was truly being who I've always been. And I said to him, and I said, I feel so good being in this environment because I feel I can be who I really want to be without having to pretend to be somebody else. And it was probably the first time that I discovered that there were times when I wasn't really being the real me. And I gave my permission to do it.
Mm.
And I think I've been happier in the workplace ever since.
Well, it's interesting that you might find yourself in a situation where there's an event or a trigger that brings out more of your authentic self. And the premise from that particular leader, who wasn't my favorite leader at the time in a learning sense, in terms of, until you're willing to face the worst possible outcome,
Yeah,
you could be self-imposing a restriction on yourself that doesn't allow you to be who you are as a person.
wow, very true. Very true. So when we're talking to nurse leaders, so Val, they supervise a great number of people in any given healthcare organization. Is there something that you would think that nurse leaders can do specifically to create the best environment for their people? And what else is in it for them other than just making a good environment for their people?
I think that's a great question, and I won't tell you throughout this podcast that that was a great question because it's one that requires you to really think. Having spent, a number of years in healthcare, and you think about the critical importance of the role of a nurse and specifically their nurse leader. And so with the spans of control that many of them have, I would say what is important is that, and this is consistent with what I say about leadership in general, is that they need to increase their self-awareness in terms of their particular leadership style. And they also need to develop versatility as a leader and appreciate that you will have team members who are very different than you, and recognizing the importance of delivering quality healthcare to diverse patients. Strengthen yourself as a leader by increasing your self-awareness, and don't apply a one size fits all approach to the people that you lead. It will put you in a much better light.
That's great, because a lot of leaders just want to follow the policies. They just want to see, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And I've always said to leaders, well, if a policy can tell you what to do, I wouldn't need to, right?
Right.
I want to interpret and apply
Mhm.
it differently to the situation. That's great. So shifting a little bit, Ovell, I think a lot has been said in the last, you know, since the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. A lot has been talked about the state of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts in organization. And I went and I looked at some statistics, and I understand that about 73% of chief nursing officers are women. But a study was conducted by the American Hospital Association Institute of Diversity and Health Management, and it indicated that only 19% of not chief nursing officers, but first level and mid-level leaders, 19% are Black nurses or nurses of color. It could be Hispanic, Native American, Black. So tell me what your thoughts about that are. Where are we at? What do you think the commitment from organizations is to DEIB is at this moment?
No, it's a great question, and Norma, one that I have been asked in forums regarding the sentiment about DE&I in today's environment. And that is a question that I intentionally don't answer. So someone will say, "Hey, Ovell, what do you think about the anti-DE&I sentiment?" And just as you started, I start reading statistics as my answer. And the reason I read those statistics is that many of them are staggering statistics. And in my opinion, that means that the work is not done. And so my learning as I took on the duties and had the fancy title of Chief Diversity Officer, after first saying, "Gulp, why me?" I had to really learn the space. And a key learning that I got out of that experience was the importance of taking a systemic approach to making sure that the outcomes are faring better if you demonstrate that you have, not consistent outcomes as it relates to diversity. And so when I talk about a systemic approach, I'm talking about what I coined in the book as the three P's: your policies, your practices, your procedures, and making sure that those are front and center as you consider making recommendations to do better. So when you think about the statistic that you mentioned in terms of populations not advancing, there's a systemic reason contributing to that as an outcome if the representation is not the same at all levels. And that's where I find that organizations need to engage in conversations. And a lot of times, based upon the polarization of the diversity topic, people aren't willing to have the conversation.
Mhm. Yeah. So I know, Ovell, from working with you, that when you became a chief diversity officer for the first time, you insisted on having talent acquisition under diversity. Tell us more about that.
Well, and for me, as a person who spent most of my career in human resources, but I was always described as a DE&I advocate, I felt like I didn't want to be the chief diversity officer who had limited resources. You
Mhm.
hear that echoed across the country in terms of DE&I, if it's a focus area, where's the commitment in terms of resources? And I remember saying, I don't want to be that person. And I knew the organization very well at the time. And I felt like for me to feel more comfortable that I would be effective in the role, I wanted talent acquisition. And arguably, from my lens, that is one of my strongest areas in terms of my HR subject matter expertise, talent acquisition. And I felt like with that, I would be able to make, bold recommendations and be able to demonstrate results.
Mhm. Great. So we know that fostering a diverse, inclusive healthcare leadership workforce also helps with issues of access to care. It helps us address issues of health disparities and health equity, which is really a hot topic in healthcare today. So, how can nurse leaders impact these efforts by engaging with the D&IB efforts?
I think that that should be front and center as a growth opportunity for anyone working in healthcare. And I recall at one organization, the nurse leadership team was they were very curious and also willing to be vulnerable. And they dedicated their annual leadership retreat to the topic of DE&I and the planning. There was so much tension as I start smiling, thinking about those conversations, a degree of caution, a wide range of emotion. But what a great example as leaders in demonstrating the commitment by allocating time and being willing to commit to the education process, and also coming out of those forums with clarity about next steps, things that we were going to do differently, etc. I think that that is an example. And if you think about the complexity of healthcare and delivery and the social determinants, the more you can equip the leaders as ambassadors for the message so that they feel more comfortable and model the appropriate behaviors for their team members, it puts us in a much better light. I know that sounds like the cliche, but that's the goal. In
Yeah.
healthcare, for me, I always try to personalize it by saying, if your family member or you were the patient, you definitely have the expectation of quality outcomes.
Mhm.
We all do.
Yeah. So I know that you started in one of these organizations, what is called a Day of Understanding. Can you tell us more about that and what impact it had in the organization?
So the Day of Understanding was very interesting from a historical perspective that culminated around the George Floyd video. And the organization was being pushed by employees to make a response, as a lot of organizations were during that time. And I got summoned into the C suite. I wasn't a member of the core C suite team, but as the leader of DE&I, it was important for the organization to hear from me. And so when I got called into the office, kind of like going into the principal's office, the decision on what the organization was going to do had already been made. And I haven't shared this with a lot of people, but the organization had decided that they were going to establish a special task force. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, no, that sounds very temporary.
Mhm.
We need to take the time to have conversations. And I wasn't the originator of a day of understanding. PwC was the originator of a day of understanding. And I had an opportunity to hear from one of their leaders. One of their employees had unfortunately been murdered, and they needed to come together as an organization to talk about it, to heal. And that was the process that they put together. And it sounded so impactful that I felt like that was the best recommendation for our organization. And I gave them the background information and they said, proceed. And the Day of Understanding has resulted in some annual focus on timely DE&I topics, violence toward Asian Americans, etc., LGBTQ topics, so that it runs the gamut and gives employees an opportunity to serve as facilitators, for people to be curious, to ask questions. It's considered a best practice.
I remember being a part of some of those conversations, and it was extremely impactful for me, and I think for many people around us. So I thought that was really great. So I know from working with you too, I mean, I'm cheating because I worked with you. You have a really key message that you deliver to people that has always stayed with me. And I didn't want to just give it up. I just
Okay.
wanted to deliver that message yourself.
Okay. No, it's interesting. I think I know what you're alluding to. So I'm going to give the audience a chance to guess, even though I know you'll be watching this podcast. What do you think was the most significant challenge that I faced as a leader in the DE&I space? I'm going to give you a clue.
Do you want me to answer?
I just tricked you, Norma. It's silence. So that's part one of the answer. Silence is what happens as you start talking about DE&I and related topics. People start looking at their shoelaces, looking away. I have a black friend, etc. All the sentiment. And without any dialogue, as we talked about with the Day of Understanding, there's not going to be any progress. So that is a mantra that is associated with me, but it's the perfect lead in to what I know you were alluding to earlier, which is
Yes.
hashtag use your voice. And so this is a card that I developed when I would have a lot of people, schedule these no subject meetings with me, and they would come in and they would tell me what was on their mind, sometimes describing what I call as horrendous stories. And I would hang on their every word, and sometimes I would start stuttering, like, oh my God, did you say anything? And a lot of times people would say no. And I was like, oh my God, you should have said something. HR, we should be advocating on behalf of employees, and making sure that if we are aware, that we try to address issues and concerns. And so this card, it basically says, I will use my voice too, and then you fill in the rest in terms of something that would be important to you to message to someone else. So very important. And it's the counter to stop the silence. Use your voice and be willing to speak up and advocate on behalf of someone else, if not yourself.
Yeah, and that can be scary at times, but it's probably worth the effort, worth the discomfort and that not just go for people of color, for LGBTQ, for women. It's not just for the minorities. It is for everyone
It's for
to
everyone.
speak when they see something that needs to be say something when something needs to be said. So I really appreciate that message from you, Ovell. So I do also know that people can ask you questions, and that you are willing to answer those questions. So what is the best way for people to ask questions and learn more about your expertise in this area?
No, I feel like I date myself when I start talking about Ask Ovell, because I actually secured AskOvell.com, which is my URL, back in like 2004. And my plan at the time was to create a newspaper column, which sounds so antiquated, really focusing on providing answers to HR related questions. Because historically, I would get contacted from people at other organizations, basically leading in by saying, hey, Ovell, I hear you work in HR. I want to talk to somebody in HR, but I really don't want to talk to somebody at my company. And basically, what I do with the Ask Ovell platform is provide an opinion based upon the body of HR practice, etc., to try to help people get through like an everyday challenge, which could be impacting their job.
Yeah, and that probably helps them use their voice, I imagine.
Yeah, a lot of the questions speak to how do I best approach, a counter offer situation, a leader who is not treating me fairly, just the whole range of questions, which is, like I said, the answers are probably impacting that person's performance, how they feel about an employer, a leader, etc.
So, Ovell, if an organization or a leader wanted to reach out to you for speaking engagement or even to get copies of your book, what's the best way to do it?
The best start is askovell.com. There, all the things that you mentioned, there are areas addressing that on the website in terms of requests for speaking, for purchasing the book, and for contacting me just in general. The
Okay.
askovell.com is the best.
Sorry about that. I should have turned that off. So this is the fun part of our podcast. This is where we're going to ask you some fun questions. And this is a spitfire, give me the answers quick portion of
That's
our
going to make me nervous.
podcast. Oh, well, I'm not committed to your comfort. I'm committed to your growth. So, in addition to buying the big house that everybody should do and read it, what book should nurse leaders read to become better leaders?
I would say The Law of Attraction comes to mind. And The Law of Attraction is a book that teaches you to choose your words carefully, the glass half full versus half empty, leading you down a path. As a nurse leader with the spans that I mentioned earlier, your employees can zero in on how you're feeling in terms of consistency, etc. The Law of Attraction is a really good read.
Great, great. I have not read it, so I'll have to check
Yeah,
that one
Michael
out.
Lozier.
Okay. So share one movie or limited series that you have seen recently that it is a must watch.
That's an unfair question for me because I would say the movie that I have watched the most, not the musical, but the actual movie, is The Color Purple. And I like
Oh,
that movie because it puts you on a emotional roller coaster and
yeah.
led to, jokes in terms of remembering some of the lines from that movie. And so it's a movie that I will just, grab a blanket and some popcorn and just enjoy. I've watched that movie so many times.
No, I just saw the musical in the theater and it was absolutely fabulous. It was absolutely fabulous. What's your favorite sports team?
A guy from Michigan, my favorite sports team has always been the Pittsburgh Steelers. I start whispering that it's interesting. Like, Ovell, really? I grew up in a time where the Steelers had the rivalry with the Dallas Cowboys, and I can name every player. I'm a Steelers fan.
Very good. I also know you're a fan of track and field, right? You go to track and
Oh
field
yeah,
meets.
I love track. This is a great year for track in that it's an Olympic year. So if
Yes.
anybody out there has access to Olympic trial tickets, look me up on
That's
askovell.com. That is definitely a sport I follow.
that's great. What's your favorite music genre and artist?
My favorite genre is R&B, and I have two favorite artists. One would be Mary J. Blige. I love Mary J. And I am a diehard fan of the late Luther Vandross. So those two, I would say, neck and neck, my all-time two favorite R&B artists.
Luther Vandross was my now and then was the song to my wedding,
Oh
my
wow!
first dance.
In my sophomore year in high school, the first song that I heard from him was "Having a Party, Bad Boy," and I was like, "That is a great song."
That's great. So, what's your favorite place to travel to?
Without any exception, the best place that I ever traveled to was Italy.
Oh,
10
I agree
days,
with you.
Milan, Rome, Pisa, Venice,
Yeah,
Florence, Firenze. It was a great experience.
love it. You and I agree on that one. Even though I am a little partial to the Caribbean too. So, last question on a serious note. What is the best piece of advice you can give someone based on your life experiences?
Now, that is a great question, but it is something that I have a definitive answer to. And I would say, especially for a leadership audience, you need to be the author of what I call life's most compelling question, which is, how are you going to be remembered? And if you decide you're going to be the author, it will cause you to do things differently. I remember being faced with that particular question, and I had to pivot many, many years ago around the big milestone birthday of 40. I was just too focused on work. And once I realized that I could have been described as a workaholic, it caused me to make a lot of different changes in terms of spending more time on community, starting my Barbie book club, because I want to be the author to the answer. I don't want someone else saying, here's how I remembered him, and I'm not okay with the answer. So that is,
Yeah,
I think, my final answer on that particular question.
that's great. Be the author of how you want to be remembered. That's a great, great place for us to close. Ovell, thank you so much for engaging with me. And we're still building an audience. So we hope that many nurse leaders tune in to hear your great advice. It's just been a total pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you, Norma. I really appreciate the invitation. And I forgot my tagline of Ask Ovell, you better ask somebody.
Thank you so much, Ovell.
Thank you, Norma.